Hello everyone, and welcome back to Like and Hood Reads. My name's Michaela, and today I'm coming at you with a quick little review of Wild Massive by Scotto Moore, which is a new sort of sci-fi genre-bending hybrid book that came out this month and in February. Wild Massive, what has been on my radar for quite some time. I don't think I included it in my anticipated reads for 2023 list because I couldn't really confirm or deny if it had queer elements to it pre-release, but now I'm come back to let you know what's going on with that, and I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to read it because I knew I couldn't buy it physically, but I was lucky enough to be able to read it on Scribd. They got it pretty much the exact day it came out. Which is super exciting, and I am glad that I read it on audiobook because after reading some of the other reviews that people left, and after having read the audiobook myself, I think that might have been the best way to go. It's always kind of difficult to say if one medium or another has some sort of advantage necessarily, but I definitely feel that some books are great on audiobook, whereas others need to be read in physical or ebook copy just for kind of the best way to consume them depending on the narrative style. But the audiobook really worked for me with Wild Massive, and I think the narrator did a fantastic job. I do have some things to say about that though, so we'll get to that in just a bit. So Wild Massive was weird. I didn't really know what to go into it expecting. It, based off just the summary, a sort of big multiversal adventure. It's about a building, the building, right? It's a building that contains all of the entire multiverse, right? Every floor is a different dimension, every floor is a different universe, a different world, and it just sort of rises up out of this desert wasteland that never ends, up into the sky, going forever and ever, with an uncountable amount of floors. You can never reach the top. And I love multiverse things, and this book, of course, the whole time I was reading it, it just kept bringing up Marvel Cinematic Universe vibes, and I know that might be a little controversial, but it's all that I could think about. I'm a fan of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but so much of what was going on in this book felt very Marvel reminiscent. This book was just a wild ride from start to finish, which is a little bit of a pun given that so much of it takes place in these massive futuristic amusement parks. I thought that the author was just doing so much with this book. They had a lot to say, and I think they were trying to contain a lot and hold a lot in their head as they were writing this story, and it comes off very octane, very high energy. It's a very energetic narrative style, which I really appreciated and I think really lent to the audiobook medium, just because it kept me engaged. This book is pretty long. I think some of the physical arcs that went out were like 500 pages, which is way more than I would have expected when I first read the description. And I'm glad I didn't have to read 500 pages of it, because there are parts of this book that I think, and that's what a lot of people were complaining about in the reviews, is like parts of it that feel info dumpy or feel very exposition heavy, and so their eyes would sort of glaze over when they were trying to read. But I didn't have that problem reading it on audiobook. I could just sort of listen, get the information that I needed, and kind of leave out the rest. And it helped me get through it rather quickly. Like when I read that some of the arcs people got were like 500 pages, I couldn't believe it because I had flown through the audiobook so quickly. So trying to set up the story, it's a little hard to get your hands on, but it's the story of this multiversal building in which people can travel between floors, aka travel between universes, travel between dimensions, using an elaborate elevator system. It's a sort of dystopian sci-fi future in which everyone knows, or a lot of people, a lot of the residents of the building are aware of the multiverse and can travel at will, depending on a lot of political shenanigans that the book gets into. But so our sort of main character, Carissa, she is an explorer of the building. She lives in one of these coveted elevators and travels between floors. And that's who I say the main character. She's one of the main characters. This book has a pretty big cast, and that was one of my complaints about the audiobook, even though I do think that might be the best way to consume this book, was that it only had one narrator, and I think it really could have benefited from a cast instead, because to sort of define the different voices, I think the narrator did a great job, especially with some of the characters. I felt like she was really bringing them to life and sort of just going harder for them than some of the others. And I think defining the individual narrative voices would have done a lot to sort of lend the characters a little bit more weight. Because one of my biggest complaints probably about this book would be a lack of, maybe development's not quite right, but a lack of character definition. They just all, especially reading the audiobook with a single narrator, they all felt very similar, and all of their perspectives felt very sort of the same, right? Not enough definition. Not like, sometimes tuning into the audiobook, like when I'm working, I would be listening and I'm like, oh, we changed perspective, this is somebody else, and I didn't realize that someone else was talking, because their narrative voice, the voice of the characters were just so the same, except for one exception. There is this one baby magic user, Tabitha. She works in one of the theme parks, and she has a sort of minor divination ability, and she's a whole lot of fun to read. And I think that the narrator was having the most amount of fun with her, because anytime it was one of her chapters, you definitely knew it. She's super quippy and super sort of whimsical, and just the way she talks was better defined than a lot of the other characters that all felt kind of the same, unfortunately. And that kind of, it took some of the personality out of it. Tabitha was definitely the character that I felt had the most amount of personality, and I ended up really enjoying her parts more so than others, just because it was a little better defined, whereas everyone else, just, it was hard to get attached to some of the characters in this book, just because there was so much hopping around and so much energy, so much happening in general. This book is definitely more plot driven than it is character driven. There are a lot of characters to keep up with, and the plot just it literally just starts off running at the very beginning, and it never really stops going forward, and there are a lot of different threads to keep up with. Part of the plot is political, so there are two sort of main forces that control the building, like that control the multiversal political scene, if you will. One of them is a sort of military corporation. It's like a military corporation at the same time, called the Association. They control like a stupid number of the floors in the building, so of the dimensions and of the worlds, and they kind of see themselves as the overall ruling body of the building, even though the building goes on forever. They can't possibly control all of it. And so much of what reminded me of the Marvel Universe in this book is, there was a lot of different things actually, but one of the elements is this team called Dimension Force, made up of this strange cast of characters that all have their own individual abilities or enhancements or powers. And they're sort of the hit squad, the A team, if you will, of the Association. And they're not heroes or villains necessarily. I don't really look at them in a villainous light, because all of that gets really torn up, right? So Moore sort of tears up the villain-hero dynamic in this book. He's not looking for heroes, he's not looking for villains. This is just a big mess of people that are all being manipulated by interdimensional forces beyond their control. Dimension Force, this sort of A-team, they were very reminiscent of like a Marvel team, of Marvel heroes. There's also the other kind of ruling big force in this book is a corporation that I can't help but think of as Disney. And I have to think that the author was holding that in his head as well. They are a big corporation that owns and runs theme parks. They're a multimedia conglomerate, so they make entertainment. They build theme parks that take up entire floors in the building, that are just reminiscent of the way that people think and talk about Disney, and just sort of the way that Disney operates. I don't know how you can I don't know how you can read this book and not think that Wild Massive is also Disney. That's the name of the company. The corporation is Wild Massive. And one of the multimedia elements that Wild Massive produces is a franchise called Storm and Desire, which is basically, it sounds like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's a media franchise made in the similar vein of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, except that instead of going on for, let's say, 20 years like the MCU, it has been going on for hundreds of years, right? Because the weird thing about this building is, like, a lot of the characters, a lot of the sort of alien species and whatnot, they can live for hundreds of years. Most of our characters are hundreds of years old, with the exception of Tabitha, who is actually only like in her 20s, her actual 20s. So another reason why I probably found her more relatable than a lot of the other characters. That was one of the issues that I had with it was just hard to relate to some of the characters, because they would be talking about things that had happened like 100 years ago, and they would be talking about it like it happened yesterday, but also just not with enough emotional weight to it as well. This MCU sort of stand-in, the of Storm and Desire, is a franchise that had over like 200 entries in it, and it's multimedia. So there are movies and shows, but there are also games, and there are also theme park rides that are all sort of canon within the universe, right? And it ends up playing a bigger part in the plot of the book, but it's just so interesting, and like it was so reminiscent of things that are happening here in our real world with Disney, with MCU, with, you know, corporate overlords, and the sort of capitalistic nature of entertainment, and what exactly it takes to sort of rule not only the world, but in this case the entire multiverse, and the sort of power that gives those corporations. And I think Moore had to be holding all of that in his head all at once. It was neat. That is not the only thing that makes it reminiscent of the MCU for me. Just the tone of this entire book felt very MCU-esque. The sort of quippiness of it, the sort of Michael Bay levels of just high-octane action, like explosions, this is happening over here, this is happening over there. Just like so much to pay attention to, especially in the action sequences. And especially towards the end of the book, where all the perspectives, all the perspectives are heading towards this big train crash in the middle, and in the train crash is just chaos. It's just Michael Bay, Transformers, MCU craziness, just a lot happening all at once to a lot of different people. Look over here, look over there. Like, it's so much information, sensory overload. And I think in the other reviews I read, some people were not enjoying that. And I can't say that I was enjoying it necessarily. It was just like a spectacle, right? It was fantastical to watch. And it was certainly entertaining. I do feel like the book lost some of its momentum, or it lost me a little bit going in towards the end, because we are following, you know, a sort of core couple of main characters that you actually care about, and then right at the end they drop off and you don't, and we switch to this like creator sort of office space where it's the interdimensional beings that brought everything else into being, right? So like an office setting where people are creating reality, and we spend the last little chunk of the book there getting like our entire understanding of the worlds turned upside down by these creators who have been manipulating everything behind the scenes as they went along, and it just sort of sucked a lot of the air out of the plot, because you're like, okay, I finally, you know, I care about these characters, and we finally got here after all this time, and now you're not. Now you're just telling me that they're like pieces on a game board, and I don't get to know, like, there's no closure at the end of this book. I don't know if Moore is gonna come back to this, but it just felt there was not a lot of closure for the characters that I did end up caring about, and just not a lot of finality to anything that was happening. I didn't get answers at the end in the way that you would hope after an adventure like this. As to whether this book has any queer elements or not, I'll say that I know that some people are getting tired of this, but like one of the realities within the multiverse, one of the floors within the building, is home to a species of shapeshifters, sorcerers, So they're born without like a assigned biological form, and they can shapeshift into a variety of different creatures and genders. This shape-shifting species uses non-binary pronouns like they and zer, and I felt like it wasn't that big a deal, especially in the audiobook. The narrator sort of does a lot of the work for you, and I didn't mind it, but I know that some people get tired of non-binary characters always being non-human, like aliens or these different species, and that's happening here again. But what can you do? I mean, they don't have a gender because they don't have a physical form that is like theirs. They're always in like some other form. They don't have a form that's theirs. So I mean, it makes sense to me, but I can understand why some people will be annoyed because we're not getting enough like non-binary characters within a human context, I guess, is sort of what is lacking. But so that is an element. We do have several non-binary characters that are from that species, and there is no romance in this book. Like, there's not a B romance plot or anything like that. So don't come in looking for any romantic plot line. However, one of the main characters, Carissa, I think that she's sapphic. I just do. Like I said, some of the characters are like hundreds of years old, and a lot of the things that lead up to are leading into this plot going into the book have happened hundreds of years ago. Some backstory hundreds of years ago. And we don't really dig in much into that. That would be another complaint I had, is that I wanted to know more about the events that were so far in the past that were sort of leading up to the fallout that was happening within the plot of the book. But she does have this sort of connection to someone in her past that we run back into in the book, and it's very vague the way that they speak to each other, but it is clear that they were very important to each other in a way that I think had to be romantic, if not sexual. I think it could have not been sexual, but it definitely was romantic, just based off the small amount of time we get to see them together in this book. So it was extremely undefined, and I almost felt like Moore didn't want, like, he sat down to write this book, and he was like, I'm not writing any romance in this book. I'm not addressing any romantic plot lines at all in this book. And that's what he did. So it's like he kind of would get to a point where you might address something romantic, and then he would just swerve around that and go into something else, which is fine. I don't think this book needed romantic plot lines. It just felt like there were a lot of points in this book where I felt like I needed more information about especially some of the past events that were happening, particularly with Carissa, who takes up a large main character sort of space in the book. There were a lot of the plot is about her past and the past of her people, and we don't get like solid flashbacks about it. Like, I had a lot of questions. It's something that I think the book would have benefited from, to slow down every once in a while and like ground me in what came before and like the events that were leading up to what was happening then, to sort of put a better context on it, because a lot of the context, be it political or historical or whatever, is just info dumpy. Like, Moore would just tell you, like a history textbook, what had happened in the past, in this very clinical, sort of detached way. And I think the book could have really benefited from digging more into that and sort of getting a little bit more of the individual perspective on these historical events that were becoming so important, particularly when it comes to Carissa's plotline. I would have liked to know more about her and Lorelai's relationship. I would have liked to know more about her relationship with her brother Kellen, and just sort of what her life was like, I guess, before, is what I'll say. Yeah, I think we could have maybe... I know this book was plenty long enough if it was 500 pages long, but I kept craving myself moments of just a little bit more focus. I think where I would have liked to focus more on individual floors and individual cultures, because these characters would have been shaped by those experiences, no matter how old they are, or how long they've been exploring the building or whatnot. They would have been, they say that they're so shaped by those experiences, but I don't really get the impact of it without sort of getting a better idea of what of what those cultures look like, of what their lives looked like in the past before these sort of catastrophic events. Overall, I enjoyed this book. I thought it was extremely entertaining, and I know it might turn someone off to say that I felt like it was like watching a Marvel movie, but it was like reading a Marvel movie. And I don't mean that as an insult. I like superhero stuff. I like Marvel. So I did enjoy it. I did find it entertaining. It might not be for a lot of people. The reviews were pretty contentious, where I saw a lot of people were DNFing it. A lot of people couldn't get into it or weren't enjoying the pace, and I can definitely understand why that would not be for everyone. It's just sort of where you have, especially if you go into the book with a lot of expectations, I think you're going to be disappointed, or you're going to be really turned off by the pacing and the tone. But I think if you just go into it looking for something fun, and looking for something entertaining, then that's what you're going to get. You're going to get this high octane Michael Bay action, Marvel Cinematic Universe ride. It's a roller coaster ride, and it doesn't try to be anything other than that, I don't think. Was there room for improvement? Definitely. Do I wish that the characters had been a little more fleshed out or a little more distinguished from each other? Certainly. But I still enjoyed it even as is. I think if Moore wanted to write anything else, within the building in this universe, or attached to this book, I definitely think I would read it, especially if it was shorter than 500 pages. Or if it had something to do with these characters so that I could get a little bit of closure, then that would be excellent. I would be into that. So yeah, this book is probably not going to be for everyone, but it is extremely entertaining. It is available on audiobook, on Scribd. So if you have Scribd, I would definitely